200 officers, 10 Western nations, one mission: acquire what Moscow cannot build. Over 200 Line X agents were positioned across 10 KGB residences in the West by 1981, coordinating the largest peacetime technology theft operation in history. The CIA assessed that Soviet semiconductor technology remained 5 to 7 years behind American designs, with microprocessors half a decade obsolete by the mid-1980s. The question: what happens when a superpower becomes structurally dependent on stolen blueprints? This dependency didn't emerge overnight. It was the calculated response to a technological gap that threatened the entire Soviet defense establishment. By the early 1970s, lack of common standards for peripherals and digital storage capacity left the Soviet Union's technology significantly lagging behind the West's semiconductor industry. The constraint was fundamental. Soviet scientists were increasingly ordered to copy Western designs without any changes, while Western fabrication pushed beyond the 1-micron barrier. By 1995, leading-edge Western manufacturers used 0.35-micron technology, but Soviet facilities struggled to achieve consistent 2-micron feature sizes throughout the 1980s. While the USSR could match American nuclear firepower, precision eluded them entirely. In 1970, Soviet authorities reconstituted and invigorated the USSR's intelligence collection for science and technology, establishing Directorate T of the KGB's first chief directorate to plumb Western R&D programs. This wasn't opportunistic espionage. It was systematic industrial acquisition. The State Committee on Science and Technology and the Military Industrial Commission provided Directorate T and its operating arm, Line X, with collection requirements. The breakthrough lay in unified command and systematic targeting. The collection effort began with a unit called VPK, the Military Industrial Commission, placed just under the Politburo, which drew up vast shopping lists of needed Western items. Unlike earlier scattered attempts, Directorate T coordinated requirements from thousands of Soviet industrial establishments into prioritized acquisition tasks assigned by region and capability. The alternative path, indigenous innovation, had already failed. Soviet leaders implemented blanket directives to abandon original development and copy American semiconductor designs, a strategy overseen by Alexander Shokin that condemned them to backwardness as they started several years behind the U.S. and never caught up. The decision to abandon original development in the early 1970s destroyed the country's indigenous computer industry. Western companies began noticing unusual patterns. Line X populated Soviet delegations with intelligence officers. In an agricultural delegation of 100, about one-third were known or suspected agents. On a visit to Boeing, a Soviet guest applied adhesive to his shoes to obtain metal samples. The systematic nature became clear. These weren't casual scientific exchanges but coordinated collection operations. The numbers revealed the operation's scope. When Line X couldn't acquire hardware or weapon blueprints in the U.S., they found the same items could be acquired from U.S. allies in Europe or Japan, where small bribes worked wonders. You pay some engineer maybe $100,000 for something that costs $5 million, recalled Stanislav Levchenko, a KGB officer in Tokyo during the late 1970s. Japan functioned as an enormous intelligence machine with almost nothing in the way of counterintelligence, allowing Line X to flourish in Tokyo. The systematic targeting extended beyond semiconductors. Since 1970, Line X had obtained thousands of sensitive documents and embargoed products in such quantity that Soviet military and civil sectors were largely mirroring their research on Western developments, with losses in radar, computers, machine tools, semiconductors, and even nuclear weapons. The financial scale was staggering. Intelligence estimates suggested Line X operations represented hundreds of millions of dollars in annual technology acquisition value, effectively subsidizing Soviet military development at Western expense. Meanwhile, Andropov recognized by 1970 that the Soviet Union was at least 6 years behind the United States in computers and software. October 1979, Santa Clara, California. A Line X officer from the Soviet consulate in San Francisco walked through the Western Electronics Show and Convention, photographing Intel microprocessor packaging displays. He collected technical datasheets on radiation-hardened satellite chips, components banned from Eastern Bloc export, claiming to represent a Finnish electronics company. The cover story worked perfectly. In the early 1970s, there were no U.S. intelligence collection requirements for technology transfer and scientific espionage. By observing Soviet delegation behavior during visits to U.S. plants, a few government officials began to suspect that a master plan was in place, but evidence was non-existent, only anecdotal clues were at hand. The myth persists that Soviet technology theft relied primarily on deep-cover, illegal agents. In reality, the KGB operated legal espionage residencies, where a legal resident gathered intelligence while based at the Soviet embassy or consulate, protected from prosecution by diplomatic immunity. Between early 1981 and early 1982, Vetrov gave almost 4,000 secret documents to French intelligence, including the complete list of 250 Line X officers stationed under legal cover in embassies around the world. The scope was vast, but employed conventional diplomatic channels. Western governments responded by tightening COCOM export controls through the late 1970s, but enforcement remained inconsistent across member nations. The constraint multiplied Line X's requirements. Now they needed intermediaries willing to falsify end-user certificates. In the mid-1970s, the KGB tried to secretly buy 3 banks in Northern California to gain access to high-technology secrets, using the Moscow Narodny Bank Limited to finance the acquisition and Singaporean businessman Amos Daw as the frontman. The result was a growing network of procurement fronts across Austria, Singapore, and Hong Kong that complicated attribution. More critically, Soviet defense planners became structurally dependent on Line X output, building weapon system roadmaps around anticipated technology theft rather than indigenous innovation timelines. Marshal Nikolai Agarkov recognized that the Soviet Union's numerical superiority in tanks and troops was becoming increasingly irrelevant in the face of America's superior precision-guided weapons and surveillance technology. Acknowledging that Bill Perry's offset strategy of leveraging technology to counter Soviet numerical superiority was succeeding. The technological disparity manifested in concrete military limitations. Soviet radar cross-section reduction techniques lagged significantly behind Western stealth development. Guidance system accuracy suffered from inferior microprocessor performance, limiting precision strike capabilities. Signal processing bandwidth remained constrained by semiconductor fabrication limits, affecting everything from communications encryption to missile defense systems. By the 1970s, Soviet leaders provided Zelenograd scientists even less leeway to experiment, implementing blanket directives to abandon original development. The systematic copying strategy created a structural paradox. The more successful Line X became at acquiring Western designs, the more dependent Soviet military programs became on continued access to foreign innovation. By 1981, Directorate T's apparatus was mature, its officers positioned, its requirements systematized. What Moscow didn't anticipate was that Colonel Vladimir Vetrov was about to photograph and supply 4,000 KGB documents on the program to French intelligence, including the complete roster of Line X personnel worldwide. The question wouldn't be what technology the Soviets had acquired. It would be whether their entire military-industrial complex could survive without it. 4,000 pages, 250 names, 18 months of access. Between the spring of 1981 and early 1982, a middle-ranking KGB officer assigned to evaluate technology intelligence walked into French DST hands with a proposition. Every Line X document he could photograph in exchange for nothing. No money, no resettlement, just ideology, bitterness, and a sub-miniature camera. The French called him Farewell. The question, can one disgruntled spy catalog an entire espionage apparatus before getting caught? This wasn't spontaneous betrayal. It was the culmination of a recruitment operation 15 years in the making. By 1981, Western intelligence agencies possessed fragmentary evidence of Line X operations. They suspected officers, tracked isolated technical theft cases, intercepted occasional communications, but lacked systematic understanding of Directorate T's organizational structure or complete personnel rosters. Traditional espionage recruiting focused on military secrets. Technology theft was monitored episodically through export control violations rather than strategic intelligence collection. No Western service had penetrated Directorate T's Moscow headquarters to access central files. The breakthrough came through an unexpected friendship forged in 1960s Paris. Vladimir Vetrov had been posted to the Soviet embassy in France beginning in 1965 as a Line X officer for Directorate T, where he befriended Jacques Prévost, an engineer working with Thomson CSF. What Vetrov didn't know, Prévost was a correspondent for French counterintelligence, the DSD. The relationship deepened when Vetrov, intoxicated, destroyed his embassy car near Montsault, and Prévost paid for emergency repairs at his own expense. After Vetrov's recall to Moscow in 1970, his career stalled. He rose through Directorate T ranks to supervise evaluation of intelligence collected by Line X agents worldwide, passing key information to relevant users inside the Soviet Union. But by 1980, professional frustration and ideological disillusionment reached a breaking point. Vetrov asked his brother-in-law, a popular singer in Eastern European countries, to use his Hungarian tour, where mail to the West faced minimal controls, to send a letter to Jacques Prévost. The letter reached Prévost on November 2, 1980. While the content appeared innocuous, Prévost understood Vetrov wanted contact and alerted the DSD. A second, more urgent letter followed within months. The alternative approach, exfiltration, would have failed. Vetrov revealed his intentions straight out. He did not wish to leave the USSR, but instead hoped to remain in Moscow and provide the DSD with all information accessible owing to his privileged position within the KGB. The French recognized the opportunity's scope immediately. When CIA Soviet Division analysts received the first farewell documents in late 1981, they immediately cross-referenced the Line X personnel list against FBI counterintelligence surveillance logs and State Department records of Soviet diplomatic personnel. The correlation was striking. Names Farewell identified as Line X officers matched individuals FBI had flagged for technical conference attendance patterns and suspicious industrial facility visits. This external validation confirmed Farewell's access was genuine. At NSC, technology transfer analyst Gus Weiss examined Directorate T requirements lists and compared them against COCOM export denial records. After studying the list of hundreds of Soviet agents and purchasers, including one cosmonaut, assigned to penetration operations in the US and Japan, the discovery was sobering. Many Soviet acquisition targets had already been blocked, but dozens of cutting-edge technologies weren't yet controlled because COCOM hadn't recognized their military applications. The numbers revealed unprecedented intelligence depth. Vetrov delivered almost 4,000 secret documents between the spring of 1981 and early 1982, including the complete official list of 250 Line X officers stationed under legal cover in embassies around the world. He revealed names of more than 200 Line X officers stationed in 10 KGB residences in the West, along with more than 100 leads to Line X recruitments. Farewell provided a list of 250 names of KGB X-line members, entrusted with collecting scientific and technological data worldwide. The operational mechanics were elegantly simple. Vetrov fed vital information to French intelligence officials for well over a year, ultimately providing over 4,000 photographed documents. In collaboration with the DSD, the CIA provided Vetrov with a miniaturized camera with advanced satellite-grade film. At his office, Vetrov braced document pages with his elbows and photographed them, each cassette allowing 100 exposures. Using standard Minox specifications, Vetrov delivered approximately 80 film rolls over the operation's duration to reach the 4,000-page total. Document transmission evolved for security. Initially, Vetrov gave documents to Prévost, who passed them to his subordinate Xavier Amel. Beginning May 15, 1981, to spare Amel, documents transited through Patrick Ferrand, military attaché at the French embassy in Moscow, covered by diplomatic immunity. The dossier reached the CIA in August 1981. February 1982, Moscow. Vladimir Vetrov sat in his apartment on a Sunday evening, knowing his wife and daughter were visiting relatives until late. He removed 2 Directorate T evaluation reports from his briefcase, documents he carried out Friday and must return Monday. One listed American semiconductor companies prioritized for acquisition. The other detailed a Line X officer's successful recruitment pitch to a British telecommunications engineer. 20 minutes, 40 exposures. The film canister went into a cigarette pack for Tuesday's handoff at a metro station newsstand. By Wednesday, the images would be in Paris, by Friday, Langley. The operational impact was staggering. A top-secret document dated June 19, 1981 reported that the VPK assigned 3,617 scientific and technical acquisition tasks in 1980, of which 1,085 were completed before year's end, credited with benefiting 3,396 Soviet research and development projects. One report stated that information provided by Vetrov neutralized 422 KGB officers and 54 Western agents working for the KGB and USSR bloc. Vetrov eventually and reluctantly accepted 25,500 rubles, roughly equivalent to 4 years of his salary. The myth persists that Vetrov was a spontaneous walk-in volunteer. In reality, at the end of 1980 or early 1981, he contacted Prevost, by then working in the Soviet Union, who operated as liaison to French DST. First contacts were initially made through Xavier Amel, an engineer working under Prevost. French intelligence gave him the code name Farewell, an English word so the KGB would assume he worked for the CIA if they learned the code name. Professional intelligence services rarely accept unsolicited offers without extensive vetting for false flag provocations. How did Vetrov avoid detection for 18 months? Estimates vary. CIA assessments suggested Directorate T focused counterintelligence resources on protecting field officers abroad, not headquarters staff. Former KGB accounts indicate periodic document accountability audits occurred, but Vetrov's analyst role allowed legitimate file checkout for evaluation. French assessments credited Vetrov's operational security discipline, avoiding pattern meetings, using brief handoffs, never removing documents permanently. The KGB unknowingly continued Line X operations normally throughout 1981–1982, unaware their entire apparatus was compromised. Soviet defense planners issued new technology requirements to Directorate T based on assumptions Line X would deliver, commitments that would go unfulfilled after Western countermeasures began. Western intelligence agencies faced a strategic decision: act immediately to expel Line X officers and risk alerting Moscow to a penetration, or sustain surveillance to understand Soviet intentions longer. The operation ended abruptly. In January 1982, French intelligence stopped receiving information from Vetrov. Later they learned he had been walking in a Moscow park when he stabbed a fellow KGB operative and a woman for reasons unknown. While in jail, Vetrov carelessly revealed in letters he had been involved in something big. Subsequently, portions of the Line X agent list in Vetrov's handwriting were given to partner nations, one of whom had a mole that passed information back to the KGB. Farewell's dossier was complete. The names were compiled, the targets catalogued, the methods exposed. Now the West held unprecedented leverage over Soviet technology espionage. The question shifted from what Line X had stolen to how NATO would transform 4,000 pages of stolen secrets into operational advantage without burning the source who had already vanished into Moscow's shadows. 47 Soviet intelligence officers expelled from France in one coordinated action, April 5, 1983. Over 200 additional expulsions across NATO countries within 18 months, targeting identified Line X personnel. The largest peacetime intelligence expulsion in Cold War history, and only the visible half of the response. Behind the diplomatic cables, a second operation begins. Identify what Line X wants most, then make sure they get exactly that. With one modification. The question: if you control the shopping list, can you turn an adversary's espionage advantage into a weapon against them? This wasn't reactive damage control. It was the systematic conversion of espionage intelligence into strategic leverage. Even with Farewell's personnel list, Western agencies faced operational dilemmas. Immediate expulsions would alert Moscow to a penetration, but disrupt only part of the network. Line X could rotate new officers into vacated positions within months. Sustained surveillance preserved intelligence flow, but allowed continued technology theft. COCOM export controls still depended on company compliance and customs enforcement, mechanisms Line X had spent a decade learning to circumvent. The Reagan administration, briefed on Farewell in 1982, orchestrated a two-track response. Track 1. Coordinate NATO-wide expulsions to hit Line X simultaneously across host countries, maximizing disruption before Moscow could reassign personnel. Track 2. Establish the Technology Transfer Intelligence Committee to systematically review Soviet acquisition targets and determine which technologies could be improved, altered to appear functional but fail under operational stress. The premise was elegant. If Directorate T trusted its procurement channels, exploiting that trust could deliver greater damage than simply denying access. NSC technology transfer expert Gus Weiss argued that Soviet managers, under pressure to meet production deadlines, would skip verification testing on equipment acquired covertly, especially items too sophisticated for USSR labs to fully validate. The breakthrough worked because Line X's very success had created institutional dependency. Soviet engineers had stopped designing certain components indigenously, expecting espionage to fill the gap. The alternative approach, traditional counterintelligence surveillance, couldn't scale to address the systematic nature of Soviet technology theft. When the CIA studied the list of hundreds of Soviet agents and purchasers, including one cosmonaut assigned to penetration operations in the US and Japan, after studying the Farewell requirements lists, the discovery was sobering. Many Soviet acquisition targets had already been blocked, but dozens of cutting-edge technologies weren't yet controlled because COCOM hadn't recognized their military applications. In Moscow, Directorate T leadership in 1983 confronted a crisis. Dozens of experienced Line X officers had been simultaneously declared persona non grata across Western capitals in coordinated timing that suggested comprehensive intelligence breach, not isolated exposures. KGB counterintelligence began polygraphing headquarters staff with access to operational files, a process that eventually trapped Vetrov, but not before the expulsions were complete. Soviet defense industry managers initially didn't connect Line X disruptions to subsequent equipment failures. The pattern only became clear when multiple systems from different Western sources exhibited similar anomalies, prompting internal investigations that revealed shared procurement paths. By then, months of production delays had compounded, and trust in the entire acquisition network was damaged. The numbers revealed unprecedented disruption. The 47 Soviet intelligence officers expelled from France represented the largest single-country expulsion of the Cold War, crippling Line X's most productive European base. French action set the template for Allied coordination. The year 1983 became the most damaging of the entire Cold War for the Soviet Union, with over 200 officers expelled from 26 different countries. The typical 3-4-year timeline to train and position replacement Line X officers created multi-year capability gaps in Soviet technology acquisition, denying critical inputs during key weapon system development phases. The Technology Transfer Intelligence Committee, established in 1982 with representatives from CIA, FBI, DoD, Commerce, State, and NSC, coordinated the first systematic U.S. government-wide approach to technology denial, converting Farewell intelligence into actionable policy. April 5, 1983, Soviet Embassy, Paris. A Line X officer received a summons to the ambassador's office at 2 p.m. 30 minutes later, he was handed an expulsion notice from the French Foreign Ministry, 48 hours to leave France. No charges, no hearing, no explanation beyond activities incompatible with diplomatic status. He was the 14th officer to receive notice that day. By evening, similar cables were arriving from London, Bonn, Brussels. The CIA's economic impact assessments estimated $8.12 billion in costs to the Soviet economy from disrupted technology acquisition over the 1980s, combining the value of denied equipment, R&D delays, and compromised system failures. This represented a significant fraction of the defense technology budget. Approximately 50 Western companies were briefed by intelligence agencies about Soviet targeting and recruitment attempts based on Farewell data, enabling corporate security improvements that disrupted Line X's cultivation of industry insiders. The controversial second track involved systematic deception operations. As later reported in Aviation Week and Space Technology, the CIA and Defense Department, in partnership with the FBI, established a program where modified products were devised and made available to Line X collection channels. American industry helped prepare items to be marketed to Line X. Contrived computer chips found their way into Soviet military equipment. Flawed turbines were installed on a gas pipeline, and defective plans disrupted output of chemical plants and a tractor factory. The most dramatic claim involved a Siberian natural gas pipeline explosion. According to Gus Weiss's 1996 CIA Studies in Intelligence article, Trojan horse software inserted into stolen pipeline control systems caused a massive explosion visible from space. The pipeline software ran swimmingly for months. Then pressure gradually mounted until the software went haywire in what Thomas Reed described as the most monumental non-nuclear explosion and fire ever seen from space. However, this claim remains heavily disputed. No independent corroboration exists outside Weiss's retrospective account. Soviet-era records released post-1991 don't reference such an incident. Energy industry experts note pipeline failures were common in Siberia due to welding defects, extreme cold stress, and inadequate maintenance. The challenge lies in distinguishing planted defects from indigenous Soviet quality control problems or design errors. Proving causation requires access to failed systems and provenance documentation linking them to specific Western deception operations, evidence not publicly available. Why sources differ reflects the classified nature of deception operations. Weiss published his account after retirement, possibly simplifying or exaggerating for effect. The USSR's collapse meant surviving engineers had no incentive to document embarrassing failures. Distinguishing sabotage from poor Soviet quality control remains analytically difficult decades later without hardware inspection. The KGB responded to expulsions by accelerating illegals' program recruitment, deep-cover agents without diplomatic ties who couldn't be expelled. But positioning illegals in technical fields with access to cutting-edge technology takes years. Directorate T also expanded third-country procurement through front companies, but this increased costs, lengthened acquisition timelines, and raised exposure risk as Western customs and intelligence agencies tightened monitoring. The unintended consequence was strategic recalibration. Soviet defense industry planners began hedging, diverting more resources to indigenous R&D and accepting longer development cycles. This weakened Moscow's military technical competitiveness through the late 1980s, contributing to the widening technology gap evident when Gulf War precision-guided munitions showcased capabilities the USSR couldn't match. By 1985, Directorate T's apparatus was fractured, officers expelled, channels compromised, trust shattered. The full consequences wouldn't appear in embassy cables or intelligence reports. They emerged years later in weapon systems that underperformed, in production lines that stalled, in military planners who realized their adversary's technological edge was widening. The question became, when you've always relied on stealing your opponent's blueprints, what happens when they start writing fiction? 3 kilotons. Summer 1982. NORAD satellites detected a massive explosion in Siberia. No electromagnetic signature, no nuclear test warning, no Soviet acknowledgement. The blast equivalent to 1/4 Hiroshima vanished into classified files for 14 years. The explanation when it emerged, not a bomb but code. Trojan horse software, allegedly planted by CIA, instructing a stolen pipeline control system to tear itself apart. One problem, no independent evidence confirms the story ever happened. The question, if you can't prove the sabotage worked, does the threat alone achieve the goal? This wasn't just about stopping one pipeline. It was about weaponizing dependency itself. Even with Line X officers expelled and channels compromised, Soviet acquisition networks adapted. They rotated in replacement personnel, expanded third-country procurement, accelerated domestic reverse engineering programs. The West could deny specific technologies through export controls, but couldn't prevent all circumvention. Traditional counterintelligence focused on arrests and expulsions, visible, legally defensible actions, rather than active deception that risked blowback if exposed. The alleged strategy exploited Soviet institutional assumptions. That covertly acquired Western technology was trustworthy because it succeeded in its original environment, and that testing every component would reveal the theft to Western intelligence. Gus Weiss claimed CIA identified high-priority Soviet acquisition targets from farewell documents, particularly software for the Trans-Siberian natural gas pipeline after the U.S. officially denied export licenses, and arranged for modified versions to reach Line X through Canadian intermediaries. The concept was elegant: embed subtle flaws that pass initial testing but fail catastrophically under sustained operational stress, imposing costs far exceeding the effort to plant defects. The mechanism allegedly relied on time-delayed triggers, valves instructed to gradually overpressurize systems, chips with degraded components that failed after thermal cycling, software with logic errors that manifested only under specific input combinations. The alternative approach, massive infrastructure investment to match Soviet capabilities, was financially impossible. The Trans-Siberian pipeline represented the Soviet Union's attempt to generate massive hard currency revenues from natural gas exports to Western Europe. Stretching 4,500 kilometers from the Urengoy gas field in Siberia to Western European markets, the pipeline would generate a 40% increase in Soviet gas production and triple natural gas export capability. Contracts worth around $4 billion were awarded to Western European firms, with European banks providing Moscow export credit lines at below-market interest rates. Soviet pipeline engineers in 1982–1983 confronted a puzzle. Newly installed control systems, acquired through trusted Line X channels after years of operational use in Western facilities, began exhibiting anomalous behavior: pressure readings inconsistent with flow rates, valve responses delayed or excessive, cascade failures where one component malfunction triggered system-wide shutdowns. Initial diagnosis blamed installation errors or harsh Siberian operating conditions where ambient temperatures reached degrees C, stressing seals and electronics. When failures clustered around equipment procured through similar channels during the same timeframe, suspicions grew. But reverse engineering to detect intentional sabotage required component-level inspection, expensive, time-consuming, and potentially unnecessary if the problem was simply poor Soviet quality assurance during installation. The ambiguity itself became a weapon. Even unproven sabotage fears forced Soviet managers to waste resources on verification testing and alternative sourcing. The numbers revealed staggering strategic stakes. The CIA estimated $30 billion in cumulative costs to the Soviet economy from technology denial and compromised equipment through the 1980s, representing 2–3% of annual Soviet GNP over the decade. Approximately 150 Soviet defense and industrial enterprises depended on Line X procurement by the early 1980s, creating systemic vulnerability where disrupting acquisition channels cascaded across multiple programs. The 18–24-month typical timeline for Soviet industrial managers to reverse engineer and adapt stolen Western designs indicated technical sophistication sufficient to detect obvious sabotage, suggesting successful deception required subtle, delayed activation flaws. 0 confirmed cases of Soviet equipment failures have been forensically attributed to CIA-planted defects in open sources, the core evidentiary gap. Summer 1982, Siberian wilderness. A Western intelligence satellite designed to detect nuclear weapons tests recorded an infrared bloom consistent with a 3-kiloton explosion, yet electromagnetic sensors that would confirm nuclear detonation reg. It stirred nothing. NORAD analysts triangulated the location to a remote section of the Trans-Siberian pipeline construction corridor. At CIA headquarters, according to Weiss's later account, a handful of officers who knew about farewell-based deception operations quietly confirmed to concerned military officials that there was no nuclear threat, but offered no further explanation. The incident disappeared into classified archives. The most controversial claim involves CIA-modified pipeline control software causing a massive 1982 explosion in Siberia visible from space. Gus Weiss's detailed 1996 account describes the operation. Thomas Reed corroborates in his 2004 memoir. The strategic logic appears sound. The pipeline was critical Soviet infrastructure. Software was on known Line X shopping lists. However, no Soviet-era or post-Soviet Russian documentation acknowledges such an explosion. No declassified satellite imagery confirms the event. Pipeline accidents were common in Siberia due to welding defects, permafrost shifting, and maintenance failures. Natural explanations exist. If real and attributable to CIA, why wouldn't USSR expose it as sabotage to justify reciprocal actions or gain propaganda advantage? Alternative interpretations suggest the operation may have been planned and software prepared, but the explosion either didn't occur, resulted from natural causes coincidentally during the sabotage program, or was smaller than described and later embellished. The story's strategic value, deterring future Soviet tech theft, may have exceeded its operational reality. Vasily Pichelintsev, former KGB head of the Tyumen region where Reed claimed the explosion occurred, denied the story, stating that while there was a pipeline explosion in 1982, it occurred near Tobolsk and was caused by shifting pipes when snow melted, not CIA sabotage. When asked if he believed Weiss's account, Reed admitted in 2010, "I don't really know if it happened." Clearly, the whole dossier episode happened. The agency had a very major campaign to adjust the tech of stuff that was being sent off to the Russians. Why sources differ reflects the classified nature of deception operations. Weiss had operational access but published retrospectively without supporting documentation. Russian archives haven't released contradicting evidence, perhaps because no incident occurred or because it's too embarrassing to acknowledge. CIA hasn't declassified corroborating files. The analytical problem remains. Soviet manufacturing quality was notoriously poor. Failure rates of 10–15% were common even for indigenously produced electronics. Proving a component failed due to deliberate Western modification versus Soviet production defects requires physical inspection, design analysis, and provenance documentation linking specific parts to CIA deception operations. None of this evidence is publicly available. By 1983–1984, Soviet counterintelligence began polygraphing Directorate T staff to find Farewell, a witch hunt that eventually exposed Vetrov but destroyed internal trust and operational tempo for months. Defense industry managers, facing unexplained equipment failures and aware of Line X compromises, demanded redundant domestic production capabilities for critical components. Ironically, forcing the indigenous innovation Line X was created to circumvent. This doubled costs and extended timelines but reduced vulnerability to Western interference. The economic squeeze tightened. USSR had to simultaneously fund domestic R&D catch-up, replace expelled Line X officers, verify existing stockpiles of acquired technology, and maintain deployed weapon systems increasingly obsolescent compared to Western equivalents. By 1985, the pipeline may or may not have exploded, but the psychological impact was real. Soviet managers couldn't trust their own supply chains. Director T's credibility was shattered internally, not by what the West proved, but by what Moscow could no longer verify. Meanwhile, the officer who made it all possible sat in a KGB interrogation room, facing questions about a stabbing in a Moscow park and letters that carelessly mentioned something big. 22 months of access. 4,000 documents delivered. February 1983, Moscow. Vladimir Vetrov walked into KGB headquarters knowing his operation was over. Not because counterintelligence caught him, they were still investigating. Because he murdered a KGB colleague and wounded a witness in a personal dispute, triggering forensic scrutiny that would expose his French contact. Sometimes espionage operations don't end with tradecraft failures. They end with human mistakes having nothing to do with the mission. The question, if the source is burned but the intelligence already reshaped NATO policy, who won? This wasn't a counterintelligence triumph. It was chance exposing what systematic investigation had missed. By early 1983, KGB counterintelligence New Line X had been massively compromised. The coordinated NATO expulsions proved comprehensive breach, not isolated cases, but they didn't know the source, scale, or whether the leak continued. Standard counterintelligence response: polygraph all headquarters personnel with access to operational files, audit document handling procedures, restrict information sharing even internally. This paralyzed Directorate T's ability to coordinate global operations while investigations proceeded. Vetrov's capture resulted from random chance, not investigative success. In February 1982, after heavy drinking and a cooling-off period imposed by the French who feared his discovery through excessive contact, Vetrov stabbed his mistress during an argument in his car. When a man knocked on the car window, Vetrov thought his spying had been discovered, so he stabbed and killed the man. The victim happened to be another KGB officer, likely looking for a bribe from what he thought were two people having sex in a highway median. Routine criminal investigation revealed Vetrov's frequent absences, unexplained contacts, and access to the exact document categories that were compromised. Under interrogation, enhanced by psychological pressure and potentially physical coercion, Vetrov confessed his French connection. KGB traced his tradecraft and confirmed he was Farewell. But the confession came 12 months after his last document delivery, 9 months after NATO expulsions began, and after Western agencies had already weaponized the intelligence. CIA learned of Vetrov's arrest through French liaison channels in spring 1983. DGSC confirmed. Their asset was blown, but the operational damage was done. Agency analysts conducted after-action assessment. Compared to typical Cold War intelligence coups, Farewell delivered comprehensive, sustained, multi-year insight into an entire KGB directorate's global operations. The value metric wasn't what Vetrov revealed in his final months, but how the initial 18 months of documents enabled strategic pivots that compounded over years. The numbers revealed unprecedented strategic impact. Vetrov's 22 months of operational access ranked among the longest duration penetrations of KGB headquarters during the Cold War. His sustained access enabled systematic rather than opportunistic intelligence. 0 additional comprehensive KGB headquarters penetrations by Western services occurred during the remainder of the Cold War, making his operation uniquely valuable. Over 100 Western individuals identified in Farewell documents as Line X recruitment targets were alerted by FBI and allied services, disrupting dozens of potential penetrations. Between 1983–1985, successful Soviet technology acquisitions fell approximately 30% compared to 1979–1981 baseline, quantifying operational disruption. The remaining 70% showed network resilience, but confirmed significant degradation. Western defense intelligence officers monitoring Soviet military programs in 1984–1985 observed indirect confirmation of Farewell's impact. Weapon system delays, technology substitutions, revised operational timelines that suggested Moscow was redesigning around suddenly unavailable Western components. The KGB's counterintelligence success arrived too late to prevent strategic failure. February 22, 1983, Moscow Metro Station. Vladimir Vetrov exited a train in the late afternoon when a personal confrontation escalated. A violent struggle, a stabbing chaos. A KGB colleague lay dead. Vetrov, blood on his coat, was subdued by Metro police. The routine criminal investigation that followed uncovered foreign contacts, unexplained absences, and access patterns matching documents Western intelligence had somehow acquired. By the time the cell door closed, the documents were already in Washington, the officers already expelled, the export controls already tightened. The myth persists that Vetrov was caught through systematic KGB counterintelligence investigation following NATO expulsions. In reality, his exposure resulted from random violent incident unrelated to espionage. Standard counterintelligence polygraphs and audits were underway, but hadn't identified him when the criminal investigation provided the break. This pattern recurs in intelligence history. Operations compromised by personal failures more often than technical surveillance breakthroughs. Why sources differ reflects institutional face-saving. Soviet-era KGB accounts emphasized investigative competence to save reputation. Western accounts highlight the irony of chance exposure to underscore operational security lessons. Most sources state Vetrov worked for ideological reasons without payment. However, some French intelligence analyses hint at nominal expense reimbursements or gifts that maintained operational credibility, standard practice to avoid suspicion if the source suddenly improved finances. The distinction matters for understanding motivation, pure ideology versus mixed incentives. The range spans zero monetary compensation to modest operational support funds of approximately $5,100,000 over 22 months for plausible cover expenses. Eventually and reluctantly, Vetrov accepted 25,500 rubles, roughly equivalent to 4 years of his salary. The disputed figure reflects protecting operational security even after source death, French reluctance to declassify financial handling procedures, and how incentive structures affect recruiting lessons for future operations. KGB responded to Vetrov exposure with sweeping internal reforms, restricting document access, implementing two-person rule for sensitive files, increasing counterintelligence presence in headquarters directorates, and reducing information sharing even between allied services like East German Stasi or Bulgarian intelligence. These reforms prevented future farewells but created bureaucratic friction that slowed legitimate operations. Approximately 40 Directorate T headquarters staff underwent enhanced counterintelligence screening post-Vetrov exposure, creating internal paranoia that reduced information sharing and coordination efficiency even after the source was identified. The estimated cost to USSR of rotating and repositioning Line X officers globally post-expulsion reached $1.2 billion, including lost operational continuity, training replacement personnel, and rebuilding networks from scratch in multiple countries simultaneously. Soviet defense planners, briefed on the magnitude of Line X compromise, began worst-case planning. Assume all Western technology acquired since 1980 was potentially sabotaged. Divert resources to verification testing, accelerate domestic alternatives even at higher cost. This strategic pivot, forced technology self-sufficiency, arrived just as Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative announcement in March 1983 demanded Soviet R&D response. Approximately 150 technology categories were added to COCOM control lists between 1982–1985. Directly informed by Farewell Requirements documents, demonstrating the intelligence-to-policy pipeline that converted espionage insight into regulatory action, outlasting the source operation. The typical 3–4 year timeline for expelled Line X officers, replacements to achieve equivalent access and productivity, compounded technology denial impact over multiple years. As part of his confession, Vetrov wrote a blistering denunciation of the Soviet system titled The Confession of a Traitor. The KGB promised he would not be executed if he provided a confession. Vetrov complied but was charged with treason, convicted by the Supreme Court, and executed on January 23, 1985. News of his execution reached France in March 1985. Vetrov was dead by 1985, but his dossier lived on. Not in filing cabinets, but in export control databases, in NATO intelligence coordination structures, in Soviet defense programs now redesigned around domestic components they could barely produce. The question was no longer what one source revealed, but whether the USSR could afford to compete without the shortcuts Line X provided. Washington was about to test that question at strategic scale. $1 billion per year. The estimated cost to Soviet economy from technology denial by mid-1980s post-farewell. March 23, 1983, President Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based missile defense system requiring microelectronics, sensors, and computing power the USSR could no longer steal efficiently. Coincidence of timing. or calculated exploitation of an adversary suddenly visible in its technical dependencies. The dossier didn't just expose spies, it revealed how to bankrupt an empire. The question, can you win the Cold War not with bombs but with balance sheets? This wasn't just about defensive technology. It was about forcing an economically vulnerable adversary into an unsustainable competition. By 1983–1984, the USSR faced compounding pressures. Farewell-enabled expulsions and export controls had degraded Line X effectiveness by approximately 30%, forcing expensive domestic R&D simultaneously. Global oil prices declined from their early 1980s peaks, reducing Soviet hard currency revenues that financed technology imports and Warsaw Pact subsidies. Defense spending consumed 15–17% of GNP according to CIA estimates, compared to US 6–7%, but military technical capabilities lagged Western advances in precision guidance, stealth, computing, and communications. Gaps Line X was supposed to close. Reagan's SDI announcement in March 1983 came 1 month after Vetrov's arrest and concurrent with Farewell-informed NATO expulsions reaching their peak. The timing wasn't coincidental. NSC and CIA assessments based on Farewell intelligence revealed Soviet military programs' dependence on Western microelectronics, signal processing algorithms, and materials science, precisely the technologies SDI would require at unprecedented scale. The strategic insight was elegant. Announce an ambitious program whose technical requirements exceeded Soviet indigenous capabilities, then tighten export controls on enabling technologies, forcing Moscow into a budget competition it couldn't sustain. SDI didn't need to be technically feasible, many scientists doubted it. It needed to be expensive to counter. Farewell proved the USSR couldn't innovate fast enough domestically and couldn't steal efficiently anymore. SDI exploited both vulnerabilities simultaneously. The mechanism was resource allocation competition. Every dollar Moscow spent trying to match SDI was unavailable for economic modernization, consumer goods, or maintaining empire cohesion. This was competition of budgets, not warhead counts. Soviet military planners in 1983–1985 confronted a crisis in strategic assessment. Internal reviews of Line X compromise revealed that dozens of critical defense programs incorporated Western technology acquired through now-exposed channels. Systems Moscow assumed were secure, but might be sabotaged or denied for future upgrades. Simultaneously, Reagan's SDI announcement demanded response. Either accept U.S. space-based missile defense advantage or develop countermeasures requiring advanced computing, sensors, and materials. The exact technologies Farewell-driven export controls now restricted. Defense Ministry economists calculated the burden. Matching SDI could cost 5–7% additional GNP annually for a decade, compounding existing 15–17% defense spending. The numbers didn't add up without economic reforms or technology access restoration, impossible post-Farewell. By 1986–1987, Gorbachev's advisors concluded the competition was economically unsustainable, driving arms control negotiations and domestic reform. The economic squeeze was already tightening. A 47% decline in global oil prices from 1981–1986, $35/barrel to $14 barrel, collapsed Soviet hard currency earnings from approximately $60 billion annually in the early 1980s to $30 billion by 1986. This halved USSR's ability to purchase Western goods or subsidize allies, making technology self-sufficiency economically mandatory but technically impossible. Meanwhile, approximately 200 Soviet enterprises dependent on Western technology imports for critical components, identified through Farewell-informed analyses, created systemic vulnerabilities across multiple sectors. The impact concentrated beyond military to civilian industrial base. By the mid-1980s, about 70% of Soviet industrial output was going to the military according to some estimates, leaving severe shortages of industrial goods for the rest of the economy. December 1987, Moscow Defense Ministry Conference Room. Soviet military economists presented classified assessments, projected costs to counter SDI, modernize conventional forces, and maintain strategic parity over the next decade exceeded available budget by 30–40%. The options: increase defense spending further, accept military technical inferiority, or negotiate arms control limiting competition to affordable levels. Every projection assumed USSR could indigenously develop microelectronics, sensors, and computing that Western export controls now restricted and Line X could no longer reliably acquire. The assumptions were optimistic. 4 years later, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The claim that Farewell Dossier directly caused the Soviet Union's collapse overstates single operation impact. The USSR's dissolution resulted from multiple compounding factors: economic stagnation, oil price collapse, Afghan war costs of $15–20 billion annually, political reforms that released suppressed tensions, nationalism in republics, leadership failures. Farewell was one element among many. It degraded Soviet technology acquisition, contributed to economic pressure, and influenced Western strategic confidence, but wasn't determinative. Why sources differ reflects perspective. CIA veterans emphasize Farewell's role to validate operational success. Academic historians note broader structural factors. Russian analysts often minimize Western intelligence impact to avoid crediting adversaries for internal failures. Reagan's SDI was more nuanced than pure bluff. Reagan genuinely believed in missile defense feasibility. Pentagon and scientific community were skeptical but pursued research. The strategic calculation incorporated economic competition elements, forcing Soviet R&D spending into areas where Western technological advantage was greatest and Farewell-enabled controls most restrictive. SDI was simultaneously technical research program, diplomatic bargaining chip, and economic warfare tool. What percentage of Soviet defense technology development depended on Line X acquisitions? Estimates vary significantly. CIA assessments suggested 30–50% of Soviet military-industrial programs incorporated Western technology acquired through espionage by early 1980s. Soviet defector accounts claimed 50–70% in advanced areas like microelectronics and precision guidance. Academic analyses estimated 20–40% across all defense sectors. The discrepancy reflects measurement methodology and sector variation. Gorbachev's administration attempted to restart technology acquisition through legitimate channels, joint ventures, scientific exchanges, licensing agreements. But Farewell-informed Western vigilance made this harder. Soviet attempts at economic reform aimed partly to generate domestic innovation capacity, but decades of Line X dependency had atrophied indigenous R&D culture in critical sectors. Engineers who spent careers adapting stolen designs lacked practice innovating from first principles. The second-order effect was cultural. Institutional learned helplessness where Soviet defense industry stopped believing it could compete independently. When Line X's shortcut disappeared, the long road back proved too expensive and time-consuming. The Cold War ended before USSR could rebuild technological competitiveness. In 1985, Gorbachev became General Secretary, launching perestroika reforms partly driven by economic unsustainability of military competition. The 1987 Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty eliminated weapon classes, partly because competition in advanced conventional and strategic systems requiring technologies post-Farewell controls restricted was too expensive. The pipeline may or may not have exploded, but the economic explosion was real. Farewell established templates still used: comprehensive source documentation, intelligence to policy pipelines converting espionage insights into regulatory action, deception operations exploiting adversary dependencies, recognition that economic warfare can achieve strategic effects without kinetic conflict. Modern cyber espionage operations targeting intellectual property echo Line X's playbook. Western responses follow Farewell's lesson. Controlling innovation flow provides strategic leverage. 40 years later, the red-stamped dossier sits in archives, 4,000 pages that reshaped technology competition, exposed an empire's dependencies, and helped bankrupt an adversary without firing shots. Vetrov's legacy isn't the documents he photographed, but proof that in modern conflict, controlling innovation matters as much as controlling territory. The shopping list became a weapon. Today's question: whose shopping list are we on and who's deciding what we get? The Farewell Dossier proved that the most devastating weapons aren't always the ones that explode. Sometimes they're the ones that expose just how much your enemy depends on you. 4,000 documents, one disillusioned analyst, and the patient work of turning espionage into economic warfare. Vladimir Vetrov may have died in 1985, but his photographs helped write the final chapter of the Cold War. But this story raises bigger questions. In today's world of cyber espionage, intellectual property theft, and technology sanctions, are we living through Farewell 2? Which nations are playing the role of Line X, systematically acquiring what they can't innovate? And more importantly, whose shopping list are we on? If you found this deep dive into Cold War espionage as fascinating as we did, there's more where this came from. Cold War Tales brings you the untold stories of technology, espionage, and the hidden battles that shaped our world. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the Cold War had more plot twists than any thriller, and we're just getting started. Drop a comment below. What Cold War operation would you want us to investigate next? The hunt for Red October's real inspiration, the race to steal atomic secrets, the secret battle for computer supremacy. Your suggestions drive our research. And if this episode opened your eyes to how espionage really works, not just stealing secrets but weaponizing them, share it with someone who loves history, technology, or just a really good spy story. Give it a thumbs up if you want to see more deep dives into the operations that changed history. Remember, the best intelligence operations are the ones you never hear about. Until now. This is Cold War Tales, where every document tells a story and every story changed the world.